I was holding a glass I hadn't touched when my father stood and thanked everyone for supporting the real family. The room paused just long enough to make it deliberate. Someone laughed softly. My mother kept her smile, fixed eyes on him. My sister didn't look up. I waited for the correction that never came. My name was still on the place card in front of me, but it wasn't in his mouth. No one stopped him. No one looked at me. I stood there, still smiling, erased in plain sight. I felt the room close around me without sound. I didn't leave the room right away. That would have made it noticeable, and nothing in my family was ever allowed to become noticeable unless it was planned. So I stayed where I was, holding the same glass, letting the moment pass over everyone else like it hadn't landed anywhere. Conversations resumed in soft layers. Chairs shifted. Someone asked about dessert. It was almost impressive how quickly things returned to normal when the damage had already been done. My father sat back down like he had completed something necessary. He didn't look at me. Not once. He reached for his drink, nodded at something my uncle said, and carried on. That was always his way. He never raised his voice. He never argued. He just decided what was true and let the room adjust around it. I remember thinking very clearly that this wasn't a mistake, not a slip, not something said in the wrong order. It was too clean, too practiced, like a line he had been waiting to say. Looked at my mother, hoping for something small, a glance, a shift, anything that acknowledged what had just happened. But she stayed exactly as she was, smiling at the guests, making sure everything looked smooth. That was her role. Keep things together. Keep things quiet. She had always been good at that. When I was younger, I thought that meant she was protecting us. All of us. But standing there, I started to understand that us had never included me in the way I believed it did. No one asked me if I was okay. No one even hesitated around me. My sister reached across the table to pass something to my cousin, her arm brushing mine without pause, without recognition. It wasn't cold. It was worse than that. It was neutral. I stayed until it made sense to move. When people began standing, when the room naturally shifted toward smaller conversations, I placed the glass down and stepped away, quietly, carefully, the way I had learned to do everything in that house. In the hallway, the noise softened just enough for me to hear my own thoughts again. I stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, trying to place what had just happened into something that made sense. But it didn't fit anywhere familiar, because this wasn't how things were supposed to work. My father had always been the one people listened to. He built everything we had: the house, the business, the reputation. People respected him because he was fair. That's what I had always been told. That's what I believed, but fairness doesn't look like that. It doesn't erase someone in a room full of witnesses and expect silence in return, and still no one followed me into that hallway. That was the part that stayed with me. Not what he said, but what everyone else chose not to do. No one came to check. No one pulled me aside. Not even later, when the evening stretched into its usual rhythm of polite goodbyes and careful laughter. I watched from a distance as my father walked guests to the door, shaking hands, thanking them again. He repeated the same words, just softer this time. More controlled. But the meaning didn't change. The real family. I stood there long enough to understand something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. He hadn't just said it for them, he had said it for me. The thing about moments like that is they don't arrive alone. They bring everything with them. Every small pause you ignored, every conversation that felt slightly off, every time you told yourself you were imagining it because the alternative didn't make sense. Standing in that hallway, I started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. Not big events. Nothing anyone would point to as proof. Just patterns. I remembered dinners where decisions were already made. Before I sat down, plans discussed as if I had been there for them even when I hadn't. My sister would speak about things confidently referencing conversations I never heard. If I asked, there was always a simple answer: we talked about it earlier. No one ever explained when earlier was. I remembered birthdays that felt slightly misaligned. The right decorations, the right food, the right people, but something about them always felt arranged, like I was being included in something that wasn't really mine. Gifts chosen correctly but without thought, smiles that lasted just long enough. Even as a child, I adjusted to it without realizing. I learned not to interrupt, not to ask too many questions, not to create moments that required attention. It wasn't something anyone told me directly. It was something I understood by watching what happened when I didn't follow those rules. Nothing dramatic. Just silence, a kind of quiet that made you correct yourself before anyone else. To my father encouraged independence, but only in ways that didn't interfere with what he had already decided. When I chose something different, he didn't argue. He would just move forward without including it. Without including me at the time. I told myself it was normal, that families had rhythms, and I just needed to find mine. But looking back, I wasn't finding a place. I was adjusting to not having one. My mother filled the gaps with reassurance that never quite settled. You know, how he is, she would say, or it's not intentional. She believed that I think she needed to, because if it wasn't intentional, then it wasn't exclusion. It was just misunderstanding. But misunderstanding doesn't repeat itself that precisely. Doesn't happen across years in different forms with the same result every time. I started noticing how often my absence didn't change anything. If I stayed quiet, things moved smoothly. If I stepped back, no one reached forward, and slowly without saying it out loud, I began to understand that I was the part of the structure that could be removed without consequence, not rejected, not pushed out, just unnecessary. There's a difference, and it took me years to feel it clearly. By the time that night happened, something in me already knew. That's why I didn't react. That's why I didn't question him in front of everyone. Because a part of me had already been living with that truth, just without words for it. What changed in that moment wasn't the reality. It was the clarity. He didn't create the distance with one sentence. He revealed it. And once something is that clear, you can't go back to not seeing it. The next morning, nothing was said about the dinner. The house moved in. Its usual rhythm. Breakfast was set. My mother asked if I wanted tea. My father read through his messages. My sister spoke about a meeting she had later that day. Something to do with the business. I listened more carefully than I ever had before. Not to what they were saying, but to what I had always missed. Details slipped into the conversation without explanation. Dates, numbers, names of people I didn't recognize in that context. My sister referenced decisions like they had already been agreed. Upon my father responded without correcting her. They were speaking in a language that assumed shared knowledge, and for the first time, I didn't fill in the gaps for myself. I let the silence stay. That's when I heard it clearly. They were discussing the property. Not in general terms, not as a future idea, but as something already structured. Ownership percentages, legal responsibilities, transfers that had already been initiated. My name didn't come up. Not once. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask. I just sat there holding my cup, letting them continue as if I were exactly what they had always treated me as, someone outside the conversation. At some point, my mother glanced at me just briefly like she had remembered I was there, but she didn't say anything. She didn't pause the discussion. She just looked away and let it continue. That was the moment, not the dinner, not the speech. Because this wasn't about perception or interpretation. This was something measurable. Legal, permanent. A structure being built that had no place for me in it, and it had been happening without my knowledge, for how long I didn't know. but long enough that it no longer required explanation. I finished my tea and placed the cup down carefully. No one reacted. My father moved on to another detail. My sister asked a question. The conversation adjusted, continued, expanded. Without me, I stood up quietly and left the table. Not because I was upset, not in the way I used to be. There was no urgency in it, no need to confront or demand clarity because clarity had already arrived. I went to my room and closed the door, not fully, just enough to create distance. Then I sat down and looked around at the space I had always called mine. It felt different, not unfamiliar. Just temporary, like a place I had been allowed to stay in, not one that had ever belonged to me. I thought about all the times I had tried to align myself with them, adjusting my choices, staying close, waiting for the moment when things would feel equal, when I would be included in the same way, but there was no moment coming. There never had been. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to fix it. I didn't go back downstairs to ask questions. I didn't bring it up later. I didn't look for confirmation or denial, because anything they said at that point would only be a version of what I had already seen. Instead, I opened my drawer and took out a folder I hadn't touched in a while. Documents I had kept without thinking too much. About why identification, old records, things that existed outside of the family structure. I placed them on the table and sat there for a while just looking at them. Not planning, just understanding. There was a difference between being left out and removing yourself, and somewhere between the dinner and that morning, that line had shifted quietly. I wasn't weight.